So you'll recognize perhaps here, this is an image from the history of the Indies of New Spain and the islands of the mainland from 1581. And it depicts the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma witnessing the comet that will kind of portend the Spanish arrival and the fall of the Aztec Empire. And this is a European source, and well, it is a hybrid source, but it is 1581, 60 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City. So this is an issue with the sources that we'll talk about briefly. So some themes. That did not work. Yes? Okay. Computer mutiny today. So some themes: the role of religion, both Catholic and Aztec, in conquest and colonization. The myths of conquest, right? It's not a total destruction of indigenous society. Spanish victory only happens with the help of indigenous allies. It's incomplete. You have indigenous cultural continuity and survival, and religious syncretism, and kind of the rise of a Mexican Catholicism. So, next slide. So first of all, I wanted to go over some terminology. We talk about the Aztecs, but really this is most accurately used in reference to the Aztec Empire, often the culture of that empire, but typically not the people themselves. The Aztec Empire involved a triple alliance of 3 city-states who encompassed a large area over which they were ruling over the Nahua people. And the Nahua speak Nahuatl. They still speak that today. There's over 1.5 million Nahuatl speakers in Mexico. Right? Again, just a reminder that indigenous history, it's not sort of timeless in the past. This is a living history. People are alive today. So the capital of the empire was Tenochtitlan, which you can see a map here. The map's from 1524. It's a European map again. It's the first kind of instance when the Europeans see Tenochtitlan. And the people who rule over Tenochtitlan, these Nahua groups, are called the Mexica. That's what they call themselves. Aztec comes from, it's a sort of mythic origin story, but it encompasses a larger kind of swath of people. And you can see in Tenochtitlan, in the heart is their kind of sacred precinct, and with their Temple Mayor and also the royal palace. So Professor Gordon discussed the European side of discovery and conquest of the Americas. Who were the conquistadors, the missionaries, what was their worldview, their motivation. But we're trying to look today at the indigenous perspective to understand the sort of Nahua worldview, the experience of conquest, and then again dispel some of these kind of pervasive myths. And we're focusing on Mexico because Mexico is the first large-scale conquest of the Americas. Professor Gordon mentioned on Monday, the Caribbean island societies were smaller, more agrarian and rural, and more dispersed. But in Mexico, the Spanish will encounter a full empire, right? Complete with its advanced trade and economic systems, social hierarchies, political rivalries, and they will also go on to encounter the same civilizational complexity in what is now Peru with the Inca only a few years later. So, all right. A note about sources. As you know, it's my favorite topic. So almost all of what we know about pre-Columbian society and the Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica comes from these sort of 4 sources. One is archaeology. One is Hernan Cortez's letters to Charles V, which, sort of built in problems there where he is describing, embellishing and justifying his motivations for conquest. He goes a little bit sort of out of pocket with this. He, in fact, also sort of sinks his ship so the crew can't turn around because they're going to march on Tenochtitlan, and that is what they're doing. So again, not perhaps the most reliable source. And then also chronicles from Spanish conquistadors, namely Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a brief account of the destruction of the Indies from 1574. He's writing in the 1560s, and he believes that he remembers the events well. But it's written partly in response to Las Casas' criticism of the sort of Spanish colonial project in Mexico, and also to a recently published account of the conquest that portrayed Cortez as the sole hero. So, Bernal Diaz has a vested interest in presenting himself and his fellow soldiers, mercenary soldiers, if you will, as these sort of victorious heroes. And then finally, you have a range of manuscripts, codices, that are ostensibly compiled, written, and illustrated in Nahuatl, sort of pictographic style by Nahua artists and scribes that details life before the arrival of the Spanish, the indigenous perspectives of conquest, and sort of cultural touchstones. So these codices, though, are all written after or right around the time that the Spanish arrive, and up to 60, 70 years later. First of all, colonizers and missionaries destroyed all of the old codices, much as they destroyed temple sculptures and art. And then, so sometimes these were written decades later, right, with scribes relying on memory and indigenous oral history traditions to preserve the experience of elders who lived through the conquest. Their interpretations of the events leading to the empire's fall perhaps are skewed with age, right? There is a strong oral tradition, though, but also can be shaped by hindsight, right? When you're looking back at the destruction of your, civilization, certain narratives and, for example, omens and signs that can be seen that perhaps were not being discussed at the time, right? And most importantly, too, these codices were typically written under the supervision of a Spanish missionary or written by one directly, kind of a sort of ethnographic study based on interviews and stories. And then not only were they translated from Nahuatl to Spanish, but they are also transliterated, right? So there's Nahua pictographs, and so the Spanish missionary philologists and grammarians are creating a new grammar and language the alphabet system to then translate that to then. So there's a high possibility, right, for linguistic and cultural disconnect, and also, again, a sort of bias or agenda within what the missionaries are pulling out. So, all right, with those caveats, it's things to consider. We have pre-Columbian society, right? This is a rapidly expanding empire. The Triple Alliance, right, this confederation of Altepetls, city-states, has been growing in the past decades. So by 1519, when Cortez appears, it's very large. They have a system set up where people send tribute. The Emperor Moctezuma II, who has his own sort of concerns about the age, what sort of age and the safety and being of his citizens, if you will, not citizens, subjects, because of these aforementioned omens. But also, there are a lot of regional and political tensions, right? Because you have this, different alliances breaking and being remade, and there are a lot of prisoners of war that are taken. And I note this because this is a deeply hierarchical society. You have a big division between nobles and commoners, and within the nobility also there's sort of distinction of the priestly caste. And then among the commoners, you also have slavery, right? Prisoners of war are often enslaved. You could be enslaved for debt. It's not, however, passed on by birth, and you can buy yourself out of slavery. So it's not the same sort of enslavement system that you'll see later on. But also, those prisoners of war were often used for human sacrifice, too, just something to flag, because then here's an Aztec or Nahua nobleman. You can sort of see the dress. And this hierarchy is sort of important to consider when we think about colonization, and we'll see shortly. So then you have Aztec cosmology. So you have a cyclical calendar of renewal and rebirth. Right? This is in part why Moctezuma is a little bit concerned about the age and what will happen to his, is this the age of destruction? Is it not? They have an extensive pantheon of gods, including the god Quetzalcoatl, who's the feathered serpent god, who's thought to perhaps return. However, the line between humans and the divine is quite close. It can be blurred. Humans can have divine qualities. If you're a great warrior, that could be because you're sort of perhaps part God. You have a godlike force within you. If you imitate a god, you can become one, which is part of a sacrificial ritual as well, right? So again, and I flag this because, as some of you may know, there is a lot of discussion about, did the Nahua think that the Spanish were gods, and this is what led to the fall of their civilization, right? And so there are sacred arts. I mentioned sculpture, feather work, feathers, especially from the Quetzal bird, which has a beautiful, glorious long tail, are sacred. They're highly valued, which the Spanish don't initially kind of pick up on. And then you do have, again, human sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli, who's a god affiliated with the sun and the sun's force. So you have to kind of sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, to keep the sun to rise every day. Right? And that is also going to be a reason why later missionaries will be so disturbed and horrified. They see it as sort of proof of this diabolical force in the indigenous peoples. Also, they have a sort of temple mayor in Tenochtitlan where they do these sacrifices. The life force that you want to sacrifice to God is often located in the heart or the hair, which is why you will then see, this is also a maize deity. It's a goddess, right? Corn is very important in this culture. Also, there is gender equity in terms of deities. You also see that in terms of women's education, women's noble status. But here you can see, this is a drawing, but it is like a sacrifice, just so you know. Right here is an example of this is from a codex, the Tovar Codex, I believe. Yes, which again is written in the late 16th century, but it's depicting this sacrifice. Okay. You also have skull racks. Again, sacrifice to God, and also there's an element of intimidation, right? If you were sacrificing prisoners of war to the gods, then you're also sending a message to your enemies, right? And so this, you have that moment of like, is this real? Is this not? How can we know? But thanks to archaeological evidence, you can see these are not skulls, they're stone reliefs that were uncovered. But can you see all the skull faces? Again, right, so this is something, the same with the human sacrifice, that it had, there were human remains sort of confirm this. But while this sounds very gruesome, let me remind you of Munster and the cages that are on display, right? This is not necessary, depending on your perspective, more shocking or not, right? So, contact and conquest. You have the arrival of the Spanish in 1519. Cortez, as we've established, is not a great conqueror by any means, but he does kind of read the room and realize, one, he needs an interpreter, and he happens to find a noblewoman who has been enslaved from a rival tribe, La Malinche, Doña Marina Malintzin in Nahua. And she becomes his translator and interpreter, and sort of instrumental in the conquest narrative. She also bears him a child before he marries her off to another Spanish noble, right? And she has a complicated history in Mexico. Again, she's seen as the kind of a traitor, but also the mother of the Mexican people. She's the first, gives birth to the first mestizo, sort of mixed person. There's also, I'm not going to say it, but because of this sort of gendered fraught history, there is a targeted, really bad word in Mexican Spanish, which I'll let you guess where this comes from. But we can ask after, not on camera. It's not nice. So then, right, you have, and you'll see this in your reading, hopefully, this Spanish greed for gold. This is something that shocks the Aztecs, Nahuatl Empire. It also shocks the Inca. They don't understand this sort of single-minded fixation of the Spanish on gold when, for example, they're turning down jade, feathers, other things of value. So I mentioned, right, there's all this political rivalry. The reason, really, that the Spanish are able to take the empire is because of their alliance with a rival group, the Tlaxcalans, right? The Tlaxcala alliance enables them to march from Veracruz on the coast all the way through to Tenochtitlan, where they're invited in by Moctezuma, who's still trying to assess what exactly is going on, where they are kept there until he is murdered. The Spanish then have to flee in the middle of the night. It's called La Noche Triste, like the sort of sad, the night of sorrows. They lose all their gold in canoes. It's a whole disaster. They lose half of their men, if not more. But then they appeal once again to their indigenous allies, and they're able to lay siege on the city of Tenochtitlan. And on August 13th, 1521, so 500 years ago last month, they take Tenochtitlan, raise it, start Mexico City, right? Sort of destroy it, lay the foundation for a new kind of Spanish claim. So, right, this is the conquest narrative. But I do want to highlight that conquest is absolutely incomplete. There are revolts throughout the 16th century, outside the Aztec Empire as well. You have the Yankee Wars, if anyone knows anything about Mexican history, which lasts from the 1520s until the mid-20th century, right? So this is ongoing. You have other indigenous revolts. You will also, with the bringing in of enslaved Africans, you will also get early slave revolts, and also basically small communities of escaped Africans who had escaped their captivity. It's called Maroons. There's, I think, Gaspar Yanga, you can look it up. He leads a very successful Maroon revolt, right? So they have a lid over the kind of control, but it's very tenuous, right? So here's just an example of, this would be a piercing that like a priest would wear right here. So this is an example of this kind of Aztec gold that the Spanish are lusting after. Colonization, right? So you have this deeply hierarchical society. You already have enslavement. You already have tribute being paid essentially to the higher ups. And so what the Spanish do is they restructure it and then just really insert themselves on top, right? Now they are the highest class. They are the ones who will receive the tribute. They also kind of cement this power by intermarrying in noble families, right? So there's structural continuity, if you will. But at the same time, there's huge demographic collapse, right? Millions and millions of indigenous peoples die, mostly from smallpox, right? There's no natural immunity. This is like the most extreme estimate, but it's sort of, there were 25 million Nahuas, and then by the end of the 16th century, there are like 2 million, right? This is huge loss of life. And this smallpox is a huge factor. It also will tie in very closely with the conquest of the Inca Empire, because essentially by the time the Spanish arrive in Peru, there's a civil war because the heir apparent has died of smallpox. Right? So again, this is not about Spanish superiority, it's about kind of natural immunity. So the indigenous slavery begins, but as Professor Gordon talked about on Monday, there's a lot of pushback, especially from the church, and Charles V is not necessarily on board. And also, the indigenous people are dying. They're dying, they're ill, they're not seen as hardy enough. And so you have then, as Professor Gordon mentioned, the start of the transatlantic slave trade in a real way. Over 200,000 Africans are enslaved and brought to Mexico in this time. And then you also start to get to this kind of cultural and literal mestizaje mixing, right? Because you have Spaniards marrying indigenous people, some indigenous people, having children with Africans. There's a whole, and this will become very racialized and categorized in Mexican society, where they will get down to the very specific. If you're, 1/3 indigenous and 3/4 Spanish, then you're castizo. But if you're this, you're a lobo. So they get very particular about this. Keep in mind. All right. The conversion campaign, Professor Gordon talked about this, and he also talked the Valladolid debate. It's an Indian question that he referenced, right? It's Juan Gines de Sepúlveda versus Bartolomé de las Casas. And the issue is, can we enslave these indigenous people? Should we even try to convert them? Are they natural slaves? Or are they natural children? And they're decided that they're natural children. They should be converted. They need to be treated very tenderly, as Charles V says. And he said, so thus they're not subject to the Inquisition, because the Spanish Inquisition is for if you break religious rules. If you're learning, you don't know the rules. And so they have their own tribunal where that is assessed, whereas, for example, all people of sort of Spanish descent and also African descent are subject to the Inquisition. But with that, you still have, especially initially, these missionaries who, have this divine mission, but see the indigenous peoples as susceptible to the devil. They're idol worshipers. The devil's influence is everywhere. They have ritual cannibalism, human sacrifice. And so you certainly have a backlash of that, while having, paradoxically, a lot of cultural preservation, because they are trying to learn how to catechize and instruct the indigenous peoples in their in the faith, right? So how do you do that on their terms? But just to note, here is a bonfire of clothing, books, and items of idolatrous priests burned by friars, right? And so you can see them sort of burning this and all the devils going away, right? That this is seen very much not as a kind of rival pantheon, but just the devil's work on earth, tempting the indigenous peoples. You also have this here. This is a great punishment of 5 major caciques, so noble lords, and 1 woman for obstinacy and returning to idolatry after becoming Christians. So this is early, and this is the Franciscans doing this, right? Because again, you can't have this sort of backsliding and obstinacy in your conversion campaign. It's one thing to not know about Christianity, but it's another to sort of openly refuse it. That said, like I said, this sort of idea of cultural preservation, you have the codices, which I mentioned. One in particular is the Florentine Codex. It has sort of 3 parallel narratives. Sort of pictures, Nahua in translation, and then in Spanish. That was written by Nahua scribes for other Nahuas to kind of retain their culture and understand their current predicaments. It's very regional specific. Again, when you're having this, you have like an elite scribe from Tenochtitlan in a certain region, right? So this is not necessarily representative, but when you don't have access to sources, this is what you have. It was written under the auspices of Bernardino Sahagún, who's a Franciscan friar who is very invested in preserving Nahua language and culture. As is another priest, and for this, this is a Testarian catechism. You can tell me what's going on. I can't tell, but this is right, this is very early, 1524. They're trying to reach out in a sort of pictographic way because that's the language that the Nahua understand, and so you have sort of illustrated catechisms for the faith. Then you have priests learning native languages. You also have priests who are coming over and perhaps having indigenous blood or like indigenous mother, and so they have a sort of a stronger command of the language. You also get these parallel texts, right? So you can see this is a confessor's manual, and you can see Spanish on one side, Nahua on the other, right? And so he's not only, I'm not a translator, so I was like turned into, but right, kind of converting or transforming the language into script and then translating it, right? So then you have this, all of this cultural contact going on, and in some ways you have these friars pushing very hard for conversion, destroying idols, destroying indigenous religious totems, but again, this is not a story of total destruction. Indigenous people have agency, they are converting on their own, there's education involved, and there's also, right, sort of syncretism and accommodation. And a great example of that is the Virgin of Guadalupe. So the Virgin of Guadalupe, who you may know is the patron saint of Mexico, she's also sort of patron saint of indigenous and mestizo identity, appears in 1531, again, very early, to Juan Diego, a Nahua Catholic convert. And he goes and tells his bishop, and his bishop is like, no, it's probably the devil. And then she appears again, and he's like, no, I don't think so. She appears again, bishop's not having it. She appears a fourth time, and she says, bring back these beautiful flowers to your bishop to prove that you've been visited by me. So he brings back these flowers. When he dumps them out, on the back of his cloak is an apparition of the Virgin Mary. This is the tilma, right? And so this is this sort of miraculous event that then sparks, right, this uniquely Mexican devotional Marian devotion, which really takes off in the 17th century. Later, again, as you're starting to craft, as it's the generations after conquest, crafting of more of a sort of Mexican identity. It will then also be used during the Mexican Revolution as a symbol of Mexico as well, right? So again, this is not, while this is a Catholic image, the Virgin Mary in her apparition to Juan Diego speaks Nahuatl, right? This is very much not a European Mary that's been coached. Then, finally, I want to kind of talk about the complexity of conquest. Right? You have cultural continuity, you have transformation, you have survival, and you have the beginnings really of a strong local religion, the sort of Catholicisms that you'll see, that indigenous religiosity is not destroyed. And I wanted to use this as an example. This is an image of the Mass of St. Gregory from 1539, and that is entirely made of feathers. It's, Mexican feather art is still a big art to say, but again, feathers are sacred. They hold sacred meaning. And so not only are they being used in this new sacred way, but also the missionaries are not always aware of the significance of this as well, right? So there's different ways of sort of resistance and cultural preservation that happens without being completely destroyed. You have this too with the stressing of kind of local religion, because it's not just indigenous people at this point, it's also, as we talked about, thousands and thousands of Africans bringing their own cultural traditions and religious ideas and practices, that then you will also get more of this sort of cultural mixing and this very unique, this unique local religion. And you'll see this all over Latin America, right? Depending on the indigenous traditions, the amount of indigenous peoples who survive, how many people who've come from Africa, who are brought from Africa, where they are from. And you see that comes up a lot even today in cultural practices like in Brazil and Candomblé, and also in attitudes towards Latin American Catholicism, where then in the 19th century you'll see a pushback, again, needing a more European Catholicism. Are they really Christian? Protestant missionaries will go to Latin America because they're not truly Christian, because it has this, again, sort of diabolical, unclean, ethnic character. But, again, despite that, it's still a thriving aspect. And you have, too, again, this is institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper with St. Peter and St. Paul in the 16th century, entirely feathers.